Alright, class, this is Mr. Hart. I'm just making this podcast to go over the material we covered in the Introduction to Science part of the class. Okay, so we will first of all look at the vocabulary. So, if you were reviewing this video or were absent for class, this is some of the vocabulary you should be familiar with. You can either look this up online or in the textbook. But one of the first things we talked about was what is science, what's its purpose, what are some of its goals, and I personally like to think of science in these terms, and more importantly, what science is aimed towards, what its goals are. And so it's to understand the natural world, to describe phenomenon, to build knowledge, and to solve problems. So in my mind, anything that tries to do these things in a logical manner is science. So I consider computer science, math, physics, chemistry, all those things to be science. Anything that's trying to, understand the world, describe phenomena, build knowledge, solve problems is science. Okay. Then we covered SI units. Okay, these are the different units for anything we can measure. Okay, this is an international standard, which is what SI comes from, and so you should be familiar with these different units, what they mean, approximately how big they are, and just how they're represented. So be familiar with these units. Then we talked about the difference between observation and inference. So an observation is anything you can directly sense. So for example, in this picture, I can see that this balloon is blue. I could smell smoke in a room, right? I can feel the hardness of a rock. I can, again, anything you can directly sense with one of your five senses, whereas an inference is something you can determine from that. So for example, I can see that there's snow on these mountains. Okay, so I could infer that it's probably early springtime, sometime after winter, okay, when the snow is starting to melt. I can also see these people waiting around near the balloon, so I can infer that there's probably some type of event or testing for the balloon. Okay, so again, an observation is something we can determine, a fact that we acquire through some type of sensory, such as sight, sound, or touch, whereas an inference is a conclusion reached on those observations. Okay. All right. Then I showed a demonstration in class called the Three Magic Cups over here. So ask a friend about it if you missed it. Then we talked about the scientific method. So hopefully by this time in your academic careers, you are familiar with the scientific method. Okay, but you should be familiar with the different steps. So first you got to ask a question. Okay, what are you trying to answer? What are you trying to determine? Then you got to do some research about it, form a hypothesis or your answer. Then you got to do some experiments to determine what you can about the question. You got to analyze the data and you got to reach a conclusion. Okay, so let's go over those steps really quickly. So we have a question that we're trying to answer, right? So let's say we're trying to answer, why is the sky blue? Or, why does California have so many earthquakes, right? It's something that can be, it's got to be a question that can be answered, right? Something that can be tested and answered in order to be a good question. Okay, so after that, you do some research. And this is a fairly new step in the scientific method, but now that computers are so accessible and the internet is so, worldwide and everything, and the information is just constantly flowing, it's easy to go and research what previous people have done regarding your question. Okay, so look up other experiments, things like that, see what you can find. Then you form a hypothesis, which is your proposed explanation of the observation. So let's say, again, I smell smoke in a room, and I could hypothesize that there's a fire burning in the room next door or something like that. Okay, it may not necessarily be right, but it's your proposed explanation based on your understanding. Okay, then you do an experiment, which will have a couple of different parts. Okay, so first of all, you got to have an independent variable, right? Something that you can change. So maybe you are testing the different amounts of salt in water, and you fill the different cups with different amounts of water. It's something that you determine, that you predetermine, and that you can change throughout the experiment. Then there's the dependent variable, which is what will naturally respond to those changes. Okay, so as you fill the different cups of water with different amounts of water, the amount of salt will naturally change on the cup, depending on the cup, right? You don't have to manually go in and change the amount of salt in the cup or anything. That amount of salt is going to naturally change because of the amount of water you put in, right? So the dependent variable is naturally going to respond to the independent variable. Okay. Then you got our control, which is just a stable state that is used for comparison in the experiment. Okay. So for example, going back to the saltwater one, maybe your control is just a cup of distilled water with no salt in it or anything in it. Okay. So be familiar with these terms again when you are doing an experiment. Okay. Then after that, you can collect your data and start analyzing, see what you can infer from these results, right, from your experiment. And then you form a conclusion, okay, which is your statement made on your specific question to answer it, okay. So again, be familiar with the scientific method. Hopefully by this point in your academic careers, you are pretty familiar with it, okay. But if you are making a participation, answer the following question. What is the first step of the scientific method? Is it A, research, B, experiment, C, hypothesis, or D, ask a question? Okay. Then we did a thumb wrestling lab. If you were gone, you can look up those instructions online on the website to see what you need to do to make that up. Okay, but it uses the scientific method. Then we watched this video about what a scientific theory is. Okay, also available on the website and can also be found at this address down here. Okay, but let's talk about what a scientific theory is. Scientific theory is just a collection of a bunch of conclusions that have been made. So for example, let's say hundreds of scientists do an experiment about the ozone, for example, on global warming. Then there can be a theory about why global warming is occurring based on all these different experiments. So it has to be built on a lot of facts, a lot of experimentation, and it gives this general principle for why something is happening. Okay, so theories like global warming, theories of gravity, things like that come from a lot of different experiments. Okay. Then we talked about the difference between a scientific law. So really simply, a scientific law is just a statement of what is occurring, while a scientific theory is a statement of why it's occurring. So for example, Newton's third law of motion says that every action has an opposite and equal reaction, okay, which is just a statement of what's happening. When an action occurs, a reaction is going to occur with it. Okay, whereas a theory is going to state why. So for example, Einstein, he had a theory of gravity, and there's also the law of gravity, right? So the law of gravity just says any two objects will have a gravitational pull between them, whereas Einstein's theory of gravity was hundreds of pages talking about, why the different particles pull towards each other, how the fabric of space-time is bent, and all this, crazy theoretical stuff that he was talking about was trying to explain why this is occurring. So a law can be a simple sentence, gravitational pull happens, whereas a theory is going to be this long explanation of why it is. Okay? So again, if you're doing participation, answer this question. The statement, every action has an opposite and equal reaction, is A, scientific law, or B, scientific theory. Okay, the next thing we talked about was scientific models. Okay, so there's 3 different types of models. Okay, and every type of model is used to help us understand a complex system by breaking it down into something that is simpler. Okay, so for example, let's think about a globe. Okay, a globe is a physical model. We can break down the globe into simple parts, right? Most of the information we want to know is where's the land and where are the mountains. Sometimes it has like political boundaries on there and country boundaries, right? But a globe is just meant to help us understand how the world is shaped, right? So it breaks it down to something smaller than the actual world, and it gives us something we can work with. It's much easier to work with a globe than it is to work with the entire Earth when we're trying to understand it. Okay, so it removes a lot of the details so that we can understand something simpler. Okay, then there are things like conceptual models, and conceptual models are things like the water cycle, things like the nitrogen cycle. If you think about the water cycle, it's this idea that water moves up into the clouds, right? Evaporates, and it goes over into the land, and then it, rains, and then it goes back into the ocean, right? That's, 4 simple steps. Whereas water, it does a lot more than that in real life, right? That's just a very, very simple, a very simple cycle that we design so that we can understand it better. Whereas water is really doing a lot more stuff than we are showing in the water cycle. But it's just a simple example that can help us understand what is happening. Okay, it's easy to visualize. It's easy to get our minds around. Okay, so conceptual models, again, remove a lot of the details so that we can visualize what's going on. Okay, and the last of all, there's mathematical models. So these are equations that are used to help us determine certain quantities. So for example, if you look at the gravitational equation, let's say you shoot a cannonball out of a cannon and it has a bunch of air resistance. The cannon's a certain size, and it's doing all these things. We don't account for all that, but it's just a simple equation that all it needs is the time and the height of the cannon. So it removes all the other stuff, all the other details that are less important, and all it focuses on is how long was it in the air and how high was it when it started. And we can trace the motion of that cannonball, even though we only have two simple variables. So it again removes a lot of the detail, focuses only on the important parts so that we can, again, calculate good approximations for what's going to happen. Okay, so those are the models. So again, if you're answering this for participation, answer this question. A globe is an example of A, a physical model, B, a conceptual model, or C, a mathematical model. And then answer this question. The Big Bang is A, physical model, B, a conceptual model, or D, a mathematical model. Sorry, A, a physical model, B, a conceptual model, or C, a mathematical model. Okay, and the last thing we were talking about was accuracy versus precision. Okay, so let's say we want to describe accuracy. So accuracy would be how close we are to the target. So if I shoot here, 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 okay, that's very accurate. I'm very close to the target that I'm trying to reach, right, the bullseye. Whereas precision, let's say I'm over here, so I'm not very close, but let's say I get all my strikes are within a very small range. That would be very precise. Okay, so accuracy is how close we are to the target, but precision is how close our individual shots are to each other. Okay, so again, in science, accuracy is how close we are to the actual measurement. Okay, let's say we're measuring weight. If something weighs 4 kilograms and we weigh it to be 4 kilograms, then we'd be accurate. And then precision is how close we are within separate measurements. So let's say we're measuring something and it weighs 3.5 kilograms and we measure it to be 3.1, 3.2, 3.15, 3.13. Okay, those would all be very precise measurements, but they wouldn't be very accurate because they're not very close to the target. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and you can look it up more online if you want clarification. But here's the last question to answer for participation. So the weight of a box is 3.43 kilograms. You measure the weight to be 3.01, 2.99, and 3.02 kilograms. These measurements are A, accurate, B, precise, C, accurate and precise, or D, neither. All right, so again, hopefully this was a good review, and answer those questions and turn them in for participation if you missed. And thank you for watching.